Welcome to the #1 show and the source of truth for all things MedTech. Here, we reveal the secrets and stories behind the investments, science, and commercialization of the MedTech industry. Every week, we'll take you on a wild ride with the biggest names in the game, from entrepreneurs and investors who are shaking up the market to healthcare providers who are revolutionizing the way we think and practice medicine. So hold on tight and get ready for a journey like no other. This is the State of MedTech. Hey everybody, welcome back to the show, and this is a very special episode. There's actually a live stream that was done towards the end of June, and it was with Sofinnova Partners and their managing partner for the digital medicine division, Simon Turner. So to be clear, digital medicine is not necessarily digital health. Digital health is kind of this catch-all phrase that I don't think anybody can really put a clear definition on. It's been like 10 years, and I still haven't found somebody who has the same definition. And so digital medicine, the best way you can think about this is that it sits at the intersection of biology, data, and computation. And, you know, when I first heard about this privately with Sofinnova, I consider myself a friend of Sofinnova. I'm a big fan of their firm and their vision. You know, this is a category that they're essentially launching and pioneering through investments and sort of deploying their extensive experience in this sector. Their partners, Edward Cliffius and Simon Turner, are essentially going to lead this new investment strategy and deploy their experience in the sector. And for Sofinnova, this is their sixth and newest addition to their multi-fund platform of investment strategies, which really spans the life science sector from seed to later stage investment. If you want to learn more about Sofinnova's investment strategy, definitely go check them out at sofinnovapartners.com. The chairman and managing partner of Sofinnova, Antoine Papineck, said that digital medicine is really revolutionizing the healthcare industry, and with new partners, their network, expertise across the healthcare continuum, they see this as a way for Sofinnova that they're essentially uniquely positioned to help entrepreneurs develop digital products and services that are going to help patients, physicians, and the healthcare systems overall. And then from Simon Turner, who's this episode is with, he said that they essentially designed the strategy to help founders leverage Sofinnova's knowledge of highly regulated, complex healthcare industries and build on the strengths of the tech industry approaches like rapid product iteration and swift commercialization, which I'm a huge fan of, and that's why I wanted to have them on the show. Sofinnova Digital Medicine will essentially respond to the challenges of overburdened health systems with speed, agility, and a deep understanding of the patient journey. So with that said, we kind of dove into this live stream to kind of make some definitions and do case-by-case studies on what qualifies as digital medicine and what the impact is. Plus, we take some great questions from the audience, and of course, we have a lot of fun. Now, before we get into this episode, I do have to give a big shout out to my partner and sponsor this quarter, Clary. If you are a venture capitalist or investor, you actually should listen to this. This will be very helpful for you. Clary is essentially a company that is designing and developing the category of revenue collaboration and governance. Why is that important? Well, as an investor, do you not get a little bit on edge and a little bit cringy when you go to your board meeting and you want to show and understand what the pipeline looks like for revenue? What does attraction look like? And it's more of reporting the weather and sort of, you know, just gossip, right? Clary gets rid of all that. Essentially, any MedTech company that's invested in having a Salesforce CRM needs to use Clary. Clary essentially automates the processes for everything that goes into Salesforce. It makes it a lot easier for the sales reps to get that information in there so that data isn't lost, and more importantly, allows the commercial leaders of that organization to have access to the information they need to run the business. Clary is a leader in revenue operations and intelligence, and they've helped hundreds of customers improve their sales and data process, and they're really focused on doing this in life sciences. So if I were a VC, if I was advising any venture firms, my recommendation is to talk to Clary and consider using them across your portfolio companies. Even if your portfolio companies are very early stage, they don't even have Salesforce, I think it's worth a conversation, because using a technology and platform tool like Clary is going to help you bring science and sophistication to how you think about revenue, how you think about pipeline, and more importantly, how are you able to predict far ahead of time based on sales activities and automation what the revenue is going to be. And let's face it, wouldn't you want to protect your investment that way? So to learn more, go ahead and click the link in the show notes below, or go to clari.com. That's CLARI.com. Click the demo. Let them know that you heard about the show. That way you're going to be fast tracked immediately to their industry partners focused on life sciences. Trust me, you'll thank me later. And finally, if you are a CEO, if you are a founder of a MedTech company and you're trying to attract investors, you're trying to get early adopters, all that can be so overwhelming, right? Well, that's why I started my company, Khateeb & Co. And that's part of the reason why I pulled the show together, The State of MedTech. So I want to work with you. I want to help you. I'm a startup guy and I love this ecosystem. So if you need help attracting investors at scale, getting your messaging out there so it's magnetic and persuasive, and finding a way to attract early adopters at scale, I like to do that through what's called the network effect. Network effects are things that you can see on social media. The most powerful companies on planet Earth, from Google to Facebook, have used that to drive their product adoption. I believe there's a way that every medtech company, especially startups, can do that. So I want to help you do that as well. If you're interested to learn more, either go to my website, khateebandco.com, shoot me a message on LinkedIn, or shoot me an email at hello@khateebandco.com. That's KHATEEB as in boy, ANDCO.com. Don't leave your marketing and your ability to attract investors and get commercial pipeline at scale up to chance. Time is of the essence. So go ahead and grab time with me. Let's talk and let me help you out. So with that being said, let's get on to the episode. Fantastic. Hey, thank you so much for joining us. So this is going to be sort of like a live interview. And I think at some point, towards the end, we'll go to some audience questions. But if real quick, you can give us a little bit of background on yourself, and then we'll kind of jump into what is digital medicine? Why is it this new venture frontier?
Yeah, happy to. And again, thanks for having me on. This is absolutely fantastic what you're doing. Very briefly, myself, most of my time has been spent in innovation development, particularly in the healthcare life science field. That's either been working in precision medicine, personalized care type approaches, either in the venture side of things or on BD topics, but also helping to scale these, what at the time were e-health companies, looking at their initial seed financing, beginning to build up a business model, which in life sciences, sometimes generating revenue just when you've started your seed is absolutely unheard of, at least back 10 years ago. And then helping them develop contracts, begin interacting with larger corporate entities, which also needed to learn a little bit, what is personalized care? What is e-health, now digital medicine, and how is it going to change and revolutionize basically the business models we see going forwards? I then joined Sofinnova about 2 and a bit years ago, where with my partner Ed, we've set up this digital medicine strategy that we're now fully operational with.
Fantastic. Wonderful. And, Tommy, just if you could just get into just a little bit of details, like what, you're a very talented individual. You have a fantastic background. What specifically made you join Sofinnova?
It was one of those kind of very easy decisions in life. And I'd say there aren't many that you will actually face. This one was a no-brainer. So I'd always thought, right, I've done some VC in my past, absolutely adored it. Then was on the business development side of things and determined one day I would go back into venture capital. But I would do so at a stage where I was able to help develop and actually bring a new strategy to the forefront within this space, and digital medicine being that kind of a strategy. So when you have an opportunity to work with the people like my partner Ed, absolutely brilliant chap who's been in the space even longer than I have, when you're able to work with people like Antoine, the Sofinnova, let's say, ecosystem, 50 years of expertise in life sciences, building extraordinary companies, building extraordinary teams across these different strategies, and then being said, here, let's now put together this new digital medicine strategy, the first of its kind in Europe. It was just a no-brainer, quite frankly. So all of the stars just perfectly aligned to say, yes, this is the time, this is the place, this is the kind of team to build this with. So between all of that, that's why I'm here, I guess.
Fantastic. And for those who are interested, if you want to learn more about digital medicine and Sofinnova, just go to sofinnovapartners.com. So Simon, let's kind of get into it. First, why digital medicine? Like, why not just kind of stick to digital health? Like, can you kind of help us delineate the two of those things?
Absolutely. And it was a key component we tackled very early on as we were building this strategy. We always thought to ourselves, okay, we've seen e-health now beginning to transform into digital health. Words like digital therapeutics were being thrown around. Digital medicine occasionally would come into play. But the trouble was we found it very opaque in terms of what types of companies were we talking about where certain subject matters were treated versus others. And in fact, the distinction that we make, and this is really to the core of Sofinnova as well, is we are life science investors first and foremost. So we focus on biotechnology, medical devices, industrial biotech. So we're very science focused. When we look at the entire digital health landscape, we find a lot of what we kind of call the well-being approaches, more B2C type models, which don't necessarily have evidence-based medicine as a core component, or really that kind of notion of we need to show impact on patients, on healthcare outcomes, etc. So we said, okay, look, there is nothing wrong with digital health whatsoever. It's just these are very different metrics to what we're used to working with. It tends to be much more CAC over LTV, traction type metrics, but not that deep science that we have. So we said, okay, let's make the distinction. Digital health will be not for us, but absolutely great players, great tech investors are able to do that, and absolutely fantastically so. We'll focus in on what we call digital medicine. And there we think about two core components coming together and finally being able to be used. And that's, on the one hand, the large quantities of data, either the fact that we can access it, that we can homogenize it, that we're able to extract insights from it, but then also the computational techniques that we're now able to apply into it. But what we're looking for is, I'd say, four key components to this. When we think about it, of course, there's always the team at the center. Who is able to execute on this? And they need to have that right mindset, that right skill set to be able to do so. But then it's four key factors. It's the global potential of these types of technologies. And that's true across all medicine for us. If you need a certain treatment and it works in Singapore, it should probably work on the East Coast of the US, for example. So hence we think of that global scalability. We think about a competitive advantage. In biotech and medtech, of course, we used to have composition of matter, these types of patent approaches. In digital medicine, we don't necessarily do so, but we're still looking for that key competitive advantage. Then it's the evidence piece. And again, whereas in biotech, medtech, it would be clinical evidence, performance, NPV, PPV, these types of metrics. We're looking at either are you able to show benefit in terms of healthcare outcomes, or are you demonstrating a clear product market fit in terms of the traction, the use case, the adoption, and the impact of it? And then lastly, it's also thinking about a platform type strategy for the companies we invest into. So this would be, for example, having a core asset, which you can then generate multiple different revenue streams off of. When we look at digital medicine itself, what we break it down into, we think about it as three core subsegments, if you will. Imagine the patient in the center of this. We go upstream into what we call enabling technologies. Now, these are the picks and shovels in silico simulation and modeling, approaches which are able to either develop new AI tools and technologies or even improve the dissemination and the adoption within the healthcare industry. That's all of the enabling technologies bucket. The next is focused around understanding the patient, where they are in their disease, their treatment journey as well. So think precision medicine, screening, diagnosis, really being able to stratify and head towards this personalized care. So each patient should get the right treatment at the right time and in the right circumstances, which conforms to their needs, quite frankly. And then the last one is downstream of that. It's the treatment side. And here we're wondering, how are we able to modulate patient behavior to ultimately impact treatment outcomes, but also the perception of a disease or side effects as such to really impact the patient and hence bring that massive benefit. So enabling technologies, analytics, and treatments, that's really what we define as digital medicine for us.
Got it. And just out of curiosity, so you mentioned, sorry about that, the joy of working from home. So something I wanted to, you mentioned earlier with digital health, you think more CAC, and for the audience, that's, customer acquisition costs. Would you say that a sort of an easy heuristic of delineating digital medicine from digital health is like digital health seems to be a lot, and again, no offense to digital health, they do clinical studies, they do a lot of data, but it's not necessarily needed for their acquisition of customers since it's more B2C, right? A lot of it's more focused on marketing, right? And so, your average consumer doesn't really know the difference between, let's say, a retrospective study and like a double-blind study. Like they don't really care, right? If you get like, let's say, Andrew Huberman to endorse like a digital health company, then like people say, oh, well, it must be good, right? But I think on digital medicine, it requires a lot more rigor in terms of the clinical studies and science because it's a much more sophisticated and complicated sell because you're selling more to enterprise. Would you say that's one way to kind of look at it?
Yeah, largely I agree with that statement. And the way we've also kind of seen the distinction is when you look at the types of expertise you require when investing in these spaces. If you imagine, quite frankly, we come from two totally separate worlds. You have healthcare on the one hand, and then you also have the tech guys on the other, let's say. And digital medicine sits somewhere in that middle perspective, in fact. So when you think about it, the tech kind of approach to a lot of the investments, and rightfully so, is kind of run fast and break things. Keep iterating, keep at it until you find a model that works, that sticks, that suddenly you have that massive ramp up in users and hence the actual revenue growth. Now, it also means that these companies, a lot of them are based on the valuations of what is your actual revenues. That will be a metric of how successful, what your enterprise value will be, and these types of things. Whereas when you go into the life science investors, the notion of our companies at the seed and Series A generating revenues in traditional MedTech and or biotech, it's absolutely unknown to us. It's just not something that these companies do. They tend to have very large research and development costs, long timelines to even get to the first patient, let alone actual start, monetization of the actual core products that they're developing. And it also doesn't tend to be done by the companies. It tends to be build and develop to a certain stage in that entire clinical development process, and then either license, sale, acquisition to pharma, which will then use its sales and marketing channels to then distribute your product. So there's that massive change, in fact, in the notions of it. We're also, to your point, dealing with things like regulatory. We here in Europe have the CE marking. We have either that for IVDR or MDR. In the US, it's the FDA, which does a lot of the regulatory burdens of this. We're also, of course, dealing with patient data. So it's things like HIPAA, GDPR compliance. And let's face it, you need to be extraordinarily careful, because if you take the run fast and break things approach to health sciences, that could actually be hurting a patient, worst case scenario, actually killing one. And that's just not something you can do. So you need to have this differentiated mindset. But at the same time, digital medicine, you're seeing revenues being generated very quickly. You're seeing this need to navigate regulatory components of that and understanding how to best integrate them into your tactical decision making. You're also seeing that the different actors and stakeholders you're working with, they tend to be ones which are, let's say, not necessarily as reactive certain times as you would want clients to be. And here I'm talking about national health systems or large scale insurers or hospital systems where the adoption cycles can be extremely lengthy. But you need to also understand how these types of solutions will integrate into the workflow. So that was, again, I guess back to your first question, why do this and why it's Sofinnova? Because you have all that expertise in-house, that we understand how these components work together. So hence tackling this totally new area, you need a new strategy and new team, but you can also leverage those 50 years of life science expertise.
Interesting. Do you feel like maybe that's kind of the, and maybe that was the issue, actually, now that I think about it, that, because digital health, I just felt like it was very exciting, but it didn't take off the way it should have. And no offense to them, but I mean, I'll just say it. I think part of the reason why is that you had a category such as healthcare with non-healthcare investors coming in with a different business model, whereas digital medicine feels a lot more that along the lines of life science investors who understand the hard science, the clinical trials, the rigor that's needed for these things, right? That feels like there's a difference, because like your usual tech investor who's looking at like month over month growth, those kind of things, those hard metrics, may not have the discipline needed to see through some digital medicine companies. Maybe a hard criticism, but that's just my perspective.
No, it's an interesting one. I also think it's just taken a long time for the entire industry to mature. Quite frankly, when we look at where has this entire digital health field kind of come and gone to, at my previous firm, we made an investment into a company called Cardiologs. Now, they were developing the first ECG analysis tool and technique. So not the actual hardware, but a software suite that was able to diagnose or basically aid in the diagnosis of patients with tachycardia, bradycardia, all of these basically systematic cardiovascular issues, but reducing the amount of time that a clinician needed to spend reviewing a 24-hour EKG, for example, down to just a few minutes. that was a massive game changer and kind of one of the first approaches to say, look, this is what we're talking about. This is not just digital health, let's say, to your point of that more consumer well-being. This is an actual medical tool with regulatory requirements that can save physicians extraordinary amount of time, but also help massively in the diagnosis of patients and hence bring them quicker onto the right treatment rather than just letting them have to wait basically until the healthcare systems and services were available. I think the other thing is, I don't know what your take is, but when I hear digital health, very often I immediately, think of my smartphone and the 450,000 applications that are considered either well-being or digital health that are on there. I mean, that's a crazy amount of stuff on there. And the other kind of scary component is some of those are providing certain kind of medical feedback to people, but in a non-regulated, unapproved version, and often don't have, let's say, the knowledge or the expertise behind it, but then also, quite frankly, are just left on the App Store and not necessarily taken care of beyond that. So you're not dealing with perfect information, not great medical grade equipment, let's say.
Right, right. Well, so privacy and data security are obviously very crucial issues in digital health, yet they do represent, I think, a significant business opportunity. How do you think Sofinnova sort of views the balance between these challenges and opportunities? And, maybe more specifically, like why does this make the sector a little bit maybe more enticing as a venture category? I don't know if it would go into that category. Maybe I feel like it should, but how do you view that?
Yeah, it's a super interesting component, and this is where almost my geeky side comes out. So
Awesome.
I'm super interested in the entire.
We're 10 minutes in. We should have tapped into that sooner. Go ahead.
Perfect. So everything that is kind of regulatory, quality management systems, etc. I find it very interesting because if you think about it, that's kind of at the core and has been built up to make sure of two things. One, that we have the correct privacy, that we are dealing with people, and again, fundamentally. We say patients a lot, but they are people. They are us. They are we who are in the healthcare systems, who are in a point of need. Deal with them correctly, but also are able to provide the guarantee or at least the very high level of certainty that if and when a diagnosis or if and when a treatment is being made, that it's done so to the best standards, the best rigor that we can possibly provide with all of the knowledge that we have to date. It's not to say it will always be perfect. And of course, we know this, healthcare outcomes sometimes are not as good as we want them to be, but we're trying the very best. And that's why the entire regulatory, the entire patient data handling component is such a critical one. The way we think about it is again, back to our life science roots. We've been in this for 50 years. You can't skimp on this type of an area. It's where, you kill a patient, you harm a patient, you let patient data suddenly flow freely. We've seen multiple examples of where this has happened, and it's destroyed trust. And rightfully so, it's brought, absolute chaos into certain companies. And again, rightfully so. When you skimp on these types of issues, you are putting people's lives at risk, and that's unacceptable. The way we think about it with our digital medicine strategy, and it's one of the things that makes me so excited with our kind of portfolio that we've built up so far, is these companies are at the forefront of also figuring out how to deal with this. And it's back to our ethos of, look, regulatory, patient data, all of these compliance components, they are scary. They require a lot of time and effort to deal with, but they can be massive value additions as well for the companies going forwards. Because as and when they set gold standards, they bring out best practices. They kind of, let's say, are luminaries in showing the way this should and will be done. You are leading the pack, and hence you are creating as well barriers for others. So you are basically creating your own competitive moats whilst also ensuring that patient safety is taken as a point front and center. It's not a secondary issue. It's something that needs to be addressed, that needs to be tackled continuously. And this is why we look at things like AI safety, verification, this notion of being able to independently validate how certain AI algorithms are working. And particularly, when you do a test or an experiment with an AI solution, and this is true even in, let's say, old school diagnostics, depending on the patient sampling, the patient cohort you're using, and then bringing that into the real world, and suddenly everything changes, you're going to get very different results and outcomes. So how are we able to assess that ahead of time, be able to therefore provide the clinical community with the true, let's say, utility of their tools? That's kind of one of the pieces that we like to deal with a lot.
Interesting. On the topic of like these various technologies, like, so AI is kind of back in the news in the last few months with, ChatGPT and these large language models.
Yeah.
One example is, sort of from the pharma world, one of the more famous or say infamous, Martin Shkreli, very sharp guy, by the way, maybe made some made some mistakes, but very, very smart guy. Actually launched a company called Dr. Gupta, which was essentially a large language model where a patient can go and interact with an LLM
Mhm.
to get medical advice. Would you categorize that as digital medicine, digital health, or something else?
Um, Depending on the type of advice and the ultimate objective that they're going for, I would say yes, it does fall into digital medicine. But you're touching on an extraordinarily important topic and point here. I mean, we've been following this for quite a while. In fact, one of our key advisors is working exactly on this topic. When you look at things like MedPalm 2 that Google have been developing, in the last 6 months, I believe it is now, they've gone from basically being able to achieve a score which is just about passing mark for a physician exam in the US to now well into expert level territory in terms of responding to medical questions with the correct information. So that's better than, let's say, your average doctor by far. The
Yeah,
problem is at times when these things get it wrong. So hallucinations, for example, if you're familiar with it, basically it
yeah.
will make stuff up and say it with such a certainty that you feel, okay, well, this must be the right answer, whatever it is. So we have this issue. And this is where regulatory immediately comes in and plays into this, as well as recent legislation we're seeing here in Europe with the AI Act. It's all playing to this is really impressive. These technology components can have massive impacts going forwards in the future. And we're betting that we need them, quite frankly. But we need to understand how they work. We need to understand if and why they will go wrong, and hence make sure that that is something we can limit as much as possible to the extent where, quite frankly, you have something that's almost a fail safe. Because
Hmm.
if, imagine, let's take a scenario where a patient is either self diagnosing, which I guess is probably one of the most common questions here. You do this online, and I mean, let's take 4 or 5 years ago on Google, you type in a bunch of symptoms and it would say, hey, this could be, cancer, or it could be a cardiovascular issue, or it could be something else. And always you would have the liability comment of go and see your doctor. This could be an issue, quite frankly. And the reality is probably most times wouldn't have been an issue, but if and when it is, you need to catch it, and you need to catch it early. So when we're seeing these chat GPT type models, whatever it's going to be, developing this space, you still have that same kind of component. They can be massively important triage tools. And we're already starting to see that being the case in certain companies that are developing the field. But you also need to make sure you are not increasing the risk of misdiagnosis or missed, let's say, diseases, which ultimately you could have otherwise tackled in the current healthcare system.
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting thing about this is that post pandemic, it seems that there's so many things that people just prefer to do like remotely via telemedicine.
Yep.
I know that for me, for a lot of my doctor's appointments and visits, the first thing I ask is like, do I got to come in for this? And I think what's interesting about something like Dr. Gupta is that Dr. Gupta, the large language model, by the way, not Sanjay Gupta, just to be clear, is that, if you have somebody who is, let's say, an elderly patient, let's say in a rural community or even
Mm-hmm.
an urban setting, right? Most of the time for them to go in, see a doctor and everything, it's a huge hassle and everything. And so I think for them to access a large language model and ask questions to either alleviate their anxiety around some issue, or even sort of direct them the right place, will be kind of important. And of course, like it's not a doctor, but these large language models like pass the USMLE step 1 with like a 98% score, which is unreal. And then even the bedside matter has been scored to be better than most doctors. And so I think there's this interesting way of like, how do we start augmenting and changing the way people view healthcare versus sort of the older model, which is I have an issue, I got to go in and see a doctor. I think
Yeah.
like for mental health, it could be a huge thing. At least when I spoke with Martin Shkreli at one point, and that was one of his things is like there's a big focus on mental health. But do you see telemedicine fitting into digital medicine? Like, and this is another area where like, does that fit more? Like, let's say from a mental health standpoint, do you see telepsychiatry fitting into more digital medicine, digital health? Is there some crossover?
Oh, yeah. So let's unpack it. There's kind of two components to it.
Yeah,
I think
your three categories was enabling technologies, analytics, and treatment. So
yeah.
I think there's the other thing is like when we look at these companies, and there's some portfolio companies I want to talk to you about from Sofinnova, like which buckets do they check off?
Yeah.
You know?
And this is at the core of it why we also thought about enabling technologies, analytics, and treatments. There's a very natural flow when you think about how these companies can develop in that space. But maybe let's take apart the first question. So on that first piece, I guess there's the telemedicine question. Is this something that we would kind of include within our scope and our kind of spectrum of investment? The trouble we see with telemedicine, at least when we think about it from a digital medicine perspective, is that global potential. Yes, there is a need for this everywhere. However, it's very difficult for a single company to scale internationally into each of the markets because you tend to have different burdens or constraints. For example, just language barriers, quite frankly. A lot of French patients would not necessarily be able to describe their symptoms in English or in another language. Same in Germany, Sweden, etc. So they tend to be very regional focused. However, the technologies that you're able to embed on top of a telemedicine type play, they could be much more global. To your point, psychiatry, psychology, there's been some extraordinary work done in this space. And actually, it's funny because it's highlighted over the last years. And I think, again, COVID has, of course, brought a lot of this to the forefront. But when we go back, the NHS was working on how can we do telepsychiatry or telepsychology already about 10 years ago. And they were looking at some really interesting metrics. So they didn't actually have a video link with the patients at one point when they were testing this out. They were looking at typing, so typing responses. And the fact that the patient was interacting with an avatar, basically just a screen, not a person, put them at ease. They actually found the patients were able to open up much more than they expected. But that also, the interesting thing was, depending on how fast they were typing, how much hesitation there was, the choice of words they were using, all of these metrics were providing data that otherwise psychologists, psychiatrists couldn't use. And this was showing them where the patient was in a state of mind, even to the point of being able to highlight if there was going to be a suicide risk, 24 hours before any potential onset. Now we're seeing those types of approaches now developing even faster. And again, now to your point with automated chatbots, or at least kind of these supporting systems, there's an amazing amount of information we are now able to extract and analyze. And, I guess if we had one on right now, it would probably be able to say, Simon is tired, Simon needs sleep. Could be because of something, whatever.
You look good to me, man.
Yeah, I'm currently a little bit jet lagged, which is why I'm saying it. But, being able to extract that kind of an information, that's the kind of true power. And those types of approaches where you're able to embed, let's say, this analysis, this providing insights to making clinical decisions much better, much faster, and much more accurately, that is definitely within the digital medicine scope. That fits within this analytics bucket. But if you imagine, and let's take the portfolio examples, if you will, we have a company called Kiro. So this is a company that takes lab data that is produced. So when you go for your blood test, you get a report on a piece of paper that shows all of your values. It could be glomerular filtration, it could be calcium ions, whatever it is, all of that. Imagine you're in all the normal values, plus or minus a bit here and there. The physician will look at this and, again, is extraordinarily well trained in doing so. We'll look down and say, everything seems fine, you're okay, let's talk again at your next checkup. What Kira is able to do is it looks at this with a much more signature type approach. Because it's handling so many thousands of reports, it's starting to see patterns emerging of what are characteristics of a report that eventually a patient will be diagnosed with. It could be any plethora of different troubles. It could be heart failure, it could be diabetes, it could be chronic kidney disease, etc. But where is there a certain level of matching at moment of diagnosis? And then if we extrapolate backwards retrospectively to say, that's the moment where we could have started to see a signature that matches this type of actual outcome for the patient. And suddenly here, this is an enabling technology if we think about it, because it's embedded in the labs, it's providing a service of being able to just send the lab reports in a much more streamlined fashion to the healthcare system, but also to the patients. So you simplify that. But then the next level that is providing is the analytics, that being able to screen these patients in an automated fashion, and then if and when a red flag pops up, alert the healthcare system that there may be an issue with this patient. You should consider X and Y pathologies. Please test accordingly. So you're changing that kind of patient trajectory of saying, look, you'll crash into a healthcare system in 3 or 4 years because of the symptoms. Now we're actually catching them pre-symptomatic, when potentially we can either have a curative approach or at least provide all the support and care required to drastically reduce the progression rates of diseases. And that's really part of the future that we see so positively with the digital medicine strategy. It's moving towards this preventive care, personalized medicine, and personalized care eventually, where we move away from a one pill fits all type model, and we get to this personalized approach of saying, maybe you and I, exactly the same condition, we may have exactly the same hereditary origins, let's say, but we're going to be radically different because, I don't know, our microbiome profiles, for example, could be totally different. Food-based, just environmental exposure-based, whatever it be. And hence, the treatments that we would require, and particularly the first line, second line, third line, they might not be the same. That's the kind of power that we're unlocking here.
Yeah, no, that's what's interesting about that is that, on one side, if you look at the billionaires of the world, like Larry Ellison, no offense to Uncle Larry, they're spending a lot of money on the pursuit of like longevity, right, and trying to live as long as possible, which is fine. It's their money. But I think what the one good thing that happens from the longevity and biohacking movement, which I'm a big fan of, is that, the brain doesn't know how to separate things, right? Very much like how there's no difference between like when you and I go and shop on Amazon, we expect that same experience everywhere else, right? We don't know how to separate these things. So I think on the same side, like in the biohacking longevity, let's say consumer digital health world, you get used to these very tailored approaches specific to you. And what I'm hoping is that patients start to bring those expectations to medicine and say, well, why don't we have this tailored precision medicine approach for when I have a pathology? I want to ask you something specific on Kira. So like interoperability and like data sharing are really critical aspects to digital medicine. And they kind of present their own set of challenges. And, I know Kira is addressing these kind of complexities in their work. How do you as a firm, and this is the part, not to put you on the spot here, this is the part where I always wonder, like with venture firms, what do they do to support their portfolio companies? So in this case, how does Sofinnova's, with their experience and everything, support a company like Kiro and other portfolio companies when it comes to like navigating the data landscape to maximize their impact on digital medicine, knowing you have these issues and complexities with interoperability, so on and so forth?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's something we actually obviously started thinking about even during the pre-due diligence of the investment opportunity itself. It was looking at the healthcare infrastructure. Kiro, of course, being a French company, great example. The French system, not the same as the German system, not the same as the UK system, not the same as the US. You have certain standards that you're starting to see, like the fire type protocols and things like that. But the reality is, it's something, one, I'd say we bring a lot of awareness and knowledge to be able to see where are the similarities between the systems, and hence also bring that into a strategy side of aspects. So which geographies would make the best next steps for Kiro as and when they internationalize. But then it's also about what are the key partners we're able to bring on board into that journey as well. Because let's face it, there's a lot of this that can't be done if you're just trying to do it alone. And it's working with the healthcare systems, working with the major stakeholders, but also, of course, a lot of the private industries. In terms of labs, let's think about it. There's only probably a handful of major lab operators throughout Europe, a couple of massive ones in the US, and then you, of course, have all the kind of, let's say, health insurance provider systems. If and when you have great links and access to them, you can foster that relationship very early on to be able to say, look, how are you operating? What are the key requirements for an integration perspective? But also, how does this fit in terms of a business model? Because at the end of the day, you need to be able to find that win-win. Otherwise, no one's going to want to push the service out. No one's going to adopt a service. And that's something I think we're relatively unique in being able to do. When you look at the companies that are involved in our funds and our strategies, those that we have been working with, have co-invested with over the last decades, we have an extraordinary amount of those links that we're able to then leverage for the portfolio companies. So on the one hand, I guess we are providing insights on the board side of things, of course, because we're very active board members. On the second, it's of course opening up that wider Sofinnova network to be able to identify if it's advisors, if it's potentially independent board members, chairmen, etc., to come on board. But then also the client basis and how to start those interactions early on to make sure the companies are in the right position as and when they should deploy product and services. So I guess it's also a bit of a case by case basis. There is not one model fits all, and that's true if it's an enabling technology like a DeepSea, or if it's Kiro focusing in on that analytics part when they've gotten to that stage, or likewise for BioCortex, which is building, let's say, across both of those segments almost simultaneously, which is part of the attractiveness of their business model. So it's really a case by case.
Yeah, I was gonna say good segue. So right now for the audience to understand, there are 3 investments that Sofinnova has made so far in digital medicine. So Kiro's one, DeepSea's the other one. So DeepSea has a very interesting approach when it comes to AI diagnostic tools. Can you kind of explain what is DeepSea? What do they do? How do they qualify as digital medicine?
Yeah, absolutely. So maybe taking a step back, one of the things we really like to look at is we're thesis driven in many ways, shapes, and forms in terms of the investments that we make. And what I mean by that, because it sounds a bit BSy, we like to kind of see where do we expect this entire ecosystem to head over the next years, and begin identifying critical bottlenecks. They could be infrastructure, they could be, let's say, a particular brick in an approach. Even just to your point earlier about telemedicine versus all the layers that you can have as services on top of it, where are those critical components and really value generation for the healthcare system? With DeepSea, they are, if I kind of liken them to anything, the App Store, or if you will, the Netflix of AI radiology. And we came to the conclusion that DeepSea is definitely the company we want to invest in. We have done so. It was because we'd spent the last years seeing how the radiology space was evolving. Now, something to note with radiology, it's a massively important component of the healthcare system. About 70% of all patients will have at some point or another a radiology analysis done as part of their diagnostic workup and or their treatment. So, it's almost inescapable. And this is things like X-ray, CT scan, MRI, PET, all of these. We've seen a massive shift over the last 6-7 years from AI and radiology being this very scary thing that was almost being pushed away, saying, no, I don't want to be replaced by AI, to now being a critical component going into the future. Radiologists look at this and say, look, my workflow is continuously growing. The amount of qualified radiologists is relatively finite. The demand for radiology services is growing aggressively because we're getting more precise scanners, so hence a wealth of more information per scan, but then also just the quantity of patients going into imaging services is growing. So AI radiology, we see that as a critical enabler of making sure that radiology remains a cornerstone and impactful for healthcare. However, when we were looking at the AI radiology companies, we kept coming across this notion of, okay, they're doing fantastic work. They're being able to do very specific feature development of an analysis tool. It could be for fracture detection. It could be for scoliosis mapping. It could be for, let's say brain volumetry and segmentation for Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, etc. All of these things. And there's about 800 companies right now in that space developing these AI features. Now, each of them seem to have a bit of an issue in that next piece of the puzzle. The building the AI feature, that they are extremely good at. The next piece, though, is building up a sales force, the commercial pipelines, the integration into the infrastructure. Let's say all of that enabling technology for AI radiology adoption, which either each of these companies would have to build at a massive cost themselves, or there would need to be a company that was able to service that. And that's where we got to the DeepSea approach. We said, right, the AI vendors, we see them working, we see them developing, but they have a scaling issue. We also see this from the healthcare systems perspective. When you spoke with radiologists, they said, look, I don't want 20 different logins. Quite frankly, I can barely as it is today. If you also add an additional click per radiology exam to my workflow, I am going to lose it. I just can't do it. And then you went and spoke with their hospital administrators and the IT side of things. And it felt almost like in certain cases that their hair was on fire already. And they said, please don't make us integrate 20 new, vendors over the next 12 months. We just can't do it. have that task force, that capability. And also from a billing perspective, just the traceability of it all. It's a crazy pain for them. DeepSea takes care of all that. It embeds itself directly into the workflow. It embeds itself directly into the PACS, which is the picture archiving system, as well as the RIS, the radiology information services. It provides access for all the AI vendors on the back end of it. And therefore, from a radiologist perspective, what happens is you have all of that incredible power of AI assessment for radiology within your workflow without noticing necessarily that it's there. You just get provided the information, you're provided that additional context for your analysis. So you go from spending minutes or maybe even an hour on an exam down to a fraction of that time. So suddenly you're able to really zip through things, but it's still the radiologist making the decision. And that's a key component maybe to bring back into all of this. We're not replacing with what we consider digital medicine, we're augmenting. And that's really, I think, important from a patient's perspective, but also from a healthcare provider perspective. You don't want to have the decision-making taken away from you. You want to have it provides you with a lot more context and insight and actionability quickly.
Yeah, and just I'm happy that you mentioned that. I'm going to highlight that for a second, which is augmenting. And again, I try not to be too provocative, but like I just can't help it. That's maybe that's why people like listening to this show. But if you look at like 5-6 years ago, Apple entering healthcare, Google, Amazon. The famous one was, what was it? Amazon, Berkshire Hathaway, JP Morgan, which took 2 years and they disbanded. So like tech had its rush and it was like one big glorious dumpster fire. And I think the reason why is that tech came into medicine and healthcare with a little bit too much bravado and said, "Oh, we are from the tech world and we're here to save you." And they came with their tech model and a tech approach, and they just said, "We're just going to disrupt this, and it's going to, disruption." But it's just not the way medicine works, and especially when it comes to what's interesting about healthcare. What makes it difficult is that a lot of the stuff you develop affects obviously the patient, but it's not the patient who's using the tools or deciding, it's somebody else, right? So it makes it more and more complicated. And I mention this because what I think is so important is to understand what is the workflow and how is the problem being solved today, and then asking, okay, how do we augment that? Maybe take it from 10 steps to 7 steps or make it better, right? It's on a really rare occasion. And I think too many tech companies, maybe subconsciously or consciously, look at something like, for example, an intuitive surgical with Da Vinci, where it's like this really radical approach to how you change surgery or do surgery, right? And say that, oh, we can do that. Most of the time you can't do that. And it has to be something that sort of tucks into the core of a workflow. So again, like with radiologists, they are, and most radiologists, they're not in private practice, they're working for larger groups. They have RVUs here in the US, or essentially like how many patients they're seeing, how many scans they're doing and everything. And so like to add like one extra step, it is like a really big deal. And so I think that's a big thing that tech needs to understand, which is really understanding the, like, how is the problem being solved today? And then how do we tuck in, right, to make it better, and not in an incremental way. It has to be almost like you reduce the amount of steps, you make things easier, but there's like a 3, 5, 10x improvement, right? That's the only way it's going to get adopted. So
maybe Omar, though, just on one thing there, I have to admit, us in the healthcare side of things, I'm not necessarily sure we couldn't have benefited years ago from the UI UX expertise that we find in tech, because quite frankly, when you look at some of the information systems that have been around for a decade or more,
they're so bad. It's so bad. No, but believe me, it's so bad. And you know what's interesting? What's interesting is the psychology of adoption and influence of technology within a segment. So like if you look at a physician side, right, a lot of their tools and everything, their UI UX is terrible like that. And then on the vendor side, a lot of the vendors systems for like MedTech companies are equally as bad looking. It's like really funny. I mean, I think the exciting thing is that like new things are changing. So like one of the partners from my show is Clarity. It's a software company that essentially layers on top of Salesforce, automate things, and then provides like predictive revenue, right? Which is great for, I think it's great for investors, but also for like the CEO of a company, right? But like they're a tech company, right? So like they kind of raise the standard. So that's DeepSea. And by the way, for the audience who's wondering, DeepSea, it's spelled C, like the letter C.
Exactly.
You know?
So DEEPC.
Yeah. I don't want people to look up deep sea and be like, this isn't medicine. This is aquatic. So the last company I kind of want to touch on, it's a fascinating one for me because it's one area that I've become interested in is BioCortex. So BioCortex essentially is a platform that looks at the complex interactions between the patient and their microbiome and treatment. And from, the thing about the microbiome and specifically gut bacteria is that we're starting to understand that like it has not only influences on your health, but even your psychological health. So like there's this whole segment developing around what's called metabolic psychiatry. I believe it was Dr. Christopher Palmer. He wrote a really good book on this. But like just for the audience, just an interesting context. If you eat a lot of like garbage, junk food and sugar, you will overgrow certain bacteria in your gut biome that will produce a neurotransmitter to control you and crave that candy more. So technically your microbiome can control your mind, right? But like, tell us a little bit more about BioCortex. How does it fit into the digital medicine portfolio? And what made you guys want to invest in them?
Yeah, and it's also a great segue, I think, as well, discussing about life sciences and tech, let's say, investing in this kind of space. We actually did the deal with Hoxton, so a fantastic tech fund based out of the UK. And it just kind of goes to show as well, and you'll see the context as well when we talk about the co-founders of this, that you kind of need the bringing together of those two worlds as well. Expertise from the tech side as well as expertise on the life science side. So it's one of the interesting things that we're seeing evolving quite a bit, particularly in terms of our deal flow and the deals that we're seeing right now, is that a lot of tech investors are coming to us with interesting either portfolio companies or new deals that they're looking at and saying, guys, we should collaborate on this. We both have incredibly specific, dedicated sets of insight. Now we can help these companies scale because of that joint expertise. So just a bit of an aside. But BioCortex is one of those fantastic examples as well of how is this entire space evolving. When you look at the two co-founders, Nick, he's a doctor by training. He's been in service, I think, for over 20 years. He's a neurologist. He's been focusing a lot of his expertise on that microbiome interaction in health and disease. When you look at his CV, he's probably one of the biggest experts on the planet in terms of actually setting up clinical studies that are able to actually extract meaningful outcome from a microbiome study. His co-founder, Mo, doesn't come from health sciences. And the first time I remember seeing something about Mo going, wow, this guy sounds pretty interesting, it was when I saw his CV and it said speaks 2 human languages and 5 technology languages. And I just kind of thought, okay, this is not the kind of thing you've tended to see in life sciences a lot, but we're seeing more and more now. So Mo is actually the former head of AI for Rolls-Royce Engineering. So coming from their aerospace division, where he was, of course, in charge of building teams that were developing very advanced, specialized in silico simulation and modeling techniques. Because what do you not want to happen with an aircraft engine? You don't want it to suddenly fail catastrophically mid-flight. So you're looking at, can we identify the stress, the failure points in silico, so then we know how to take care of this from a preventative medicine perspective. That's the type of incredible, let's say, knowledge and expertise, and also just approaches that other industries have developed over years that we can now start bringing into life sciences. Because let's face it, preventative maintenance in engineering terms would just be preventive care in ours. It's finding out, are you at risk of a pathology? How can we help you avoid that pathology? Can we pre-treat? Can we remove in a curative fashion versus eventually getting to a chronic state, etc.? That's the same kind of an aspect. So back to the BioCortex discussion. I've gotten a bit off tangent here.
Not at all. This show's all about tangents, man. We love those tangents.
Perfect. In that case, I feel completely at home.
Yeah, you're at home here, man.
BioCortex, I love this company in that we did the seed with Hoxton, as I said. Nick and Mo are just fantastic at developing technology and iterating on their approach. So they fit in the enabling technology category, if you will, that let's develop this enormously complex and comprehensive understanding of how the microbiome, be it in the gut or elsewhere, is interacting with humans, with other biology, creating metabolites, impacting genes, changing the way treatments are being either metabolized or taken up into the system. So it could be either a direct drug sink, indirect changes, indirect off-target issues, etc. And The complexity, of course, of this is absolutely monstrous. When you think about it, there's 10 times more microbiome cells than there are actual human cells. So we make a little bit of the joke of, are we actually just a skeleton walking around with a microbiome rather than an actual human with a microbiome inside of us? Anyways, aside again. So what they've done is they've been able to demonstrate the power of this by then looking at clinical trials and being able to start predicting, what are the probability of patients that will respond and or not respond to certain treatments, given that microbiome profile that they have. And what we're seeing is, of course, this has been happening, or people have been working on this for about a decade, and we haven't really seen much happen. We've seen certain kind of very incremental effects, about one or two species in general that were known to have an impact on health or outcomes, let's say. Now they've totally turned this on the head and said, let's look at the complexity of the total microbiome. And that's really the power that now BioCortex has been able to unlock. So the applications are everything from clinical trial enrollment, because that way you know what you expect your cohort to actually respond and or not respond, just because of their microbiome profile, not necessarily because of the disease medication interaction, but that microbiome piece, that fog of war has been lifted, which otherwise we just said, let's keep our fingers crossed and hope for the best. So that's one piece of it. We can imagine into the next phase, and again, of course, this will require regulatory constraints as well, and validation, evidence-based medicine. They'll move from the enabling technology into analytics by then being able to provide a set of tools to then identify what is the best treatment approach based on not only the patient's genetic and or other clinical factors, but also their microbiome, to ensure we have a positive outcome, or at least we're not giving medication uselessly to patients. So that's the next one, that precision medicine front. And then ultimately, what you can even start imagining is getting to a point where you start modulating potentially the actual microbiome. So you can take a non-responder and push them into a responder type territory. And today we're starting to see signs of this already happening with fecal transplants, for example. But it's not an exact science. It's pretty much a bit of a cluster bombing exercise of, we hope we've hit something that's right. In future, we might be able to get to a point where one or two targeted modulations could be the difference between a non-responder and suddenly a responder profile being brought online. And that's kind of the power of it. But if you think about it, the microbiome was one of those last components for us that was existing that we didn't actually have a lot of knowledge into. That's now being unlocked. But these same types of approaches, the complexity with which we're able to model now, we can see that into a lot of other conditions. If it's oncology, if it's autoimmune diseases, mapping the immune system, these are all areas where we're probably going to see these types of approaches develop massively. We already are.
Yeah, and it's interesting you mentioned it. It seems like the majority of these companies, I mean, they fit all three of these buckets you mentioned, which is enabling technologies, analytics, and treatment. But obviously, you can't be strong in all of them, right? There has to be a tip of the spear, right? So and when I say tip of the spear in terms of an adoption, right? And so do you feel like, I don't know what the right question to ask here is that I'm just wondering, where is it?
How to play the segment, I guess.
Yeah, because I'll give you a great example on the analytics side. I think there's a lot of companies I've seen, both in life sciences and tech, who are analytics company. They have all this data, but they have a really, really hard time driving adoption and, more importantly, getting people to pay for it. There's I think every analytics company, people are like, wow, that's really interesting. The key is can you get somebody to pay for it? I've seen more often something that has a strong treatment or enabling technology profile, and then it happens to have analytics because people are used to paying for, right? So I'm just wondering, how do you look at that?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question. I mean, ultimately, we're also talking about preventative care and how do we get business models for preventive medicine, which, let's face it, is basically avoiding something happening. So it's moving from a reactive-based approach, which we are today, to a proactive-based approach where we're saying, let's tackle the problem before it becomes an issue later on. The reality is, I don't think we've seen a great model to date, except in certain niche cases where we're able to shift the needle quite a lot. But ultimately, what you're looking at is, how are you able to show the value that you have? And you cited a few numbers previously, Omar, which I thought was pretty on the ball. It was a 2x, 5x, 10x type improvement. And in these types of areas, I think if you're vying for a 10x improvement in terms of cost, timelines, speed to decision making, etc., that's probably the kind of area you want to at least be targeting. You probably won't necessarily achieve it, but at least if that's setting out the target, it's going to be a high impact regardless of what you develop. And then you can have that justification. The complexity very often, at least in healthcare, is the person who will pay is probably not the same as the person who will prescribe, who's probably not the same person as the person who will ultimately benefit, let's say, from an impact perspective. And it's being able to understand that complexity, particularly when jumping from a EU position to a US position, because again, things change quite drastically between those two major setups. And even within the EU, we have a lot of differences in healthcare systems. If and when you're able to understand that intricacy and build a model which therefore has benefit to everyone, aligns all those stakeholders, then you're pretty much in a good trajectory, in a good spot. When you create a disalignment or disincentivization there somewhere, you're going to probably run into issues which will take an insane amount of time, money, and effort to overcome. And hence, either doesn't become a venture case or, in fact, requires a total overhaul of the healthcare system as we know it. And that's very difficult. That's moving mountains, but sometimes with a mini digger than anything else.
Yeah, no, yeah, it's really true. And you're right that, I mean, just within the EU, you have very, very different health systems. I mean, what you find in the UK, for example, is going to be very different from like France or Germany.
Mhm.
It used to be that Europe was a good place to get EU marking from a regulatory standpoint, get some clinical trials done, get some clinical traction,
Oh
tighten
boy.
up your marketing, and then you know where this is going, and then make your jump over to the US. But then things changed in the last few years, and it's become actually more difficult to get EU marketing, EU marking, right, for regulatory clearance. And so it's almost as though, I don't know, a lot of the innovation is going to start going elsewhere. I don't know if it'll go straight to the US, but maybe it'll go to places like, I don't know, Australia, Canada, maybe other parts of the world, India, for example. So how do you see that affecting your portfolio companies? And at least when you take on new investments, like what's your advice to companies, who are facing that? Because like that's kind of like, it's really tough, right?
Oh yeah.
It makes it really, really difficult.
Yeah, and again, I mean, we haven't talked about this, but I'm a European at heart. This is why I'm working out of France. This is why I live there. Um, it's funny because I would say, in terms of the expertise we have at our fingertips in Europe, we're possibly second to none. Obviously, I'm going to be very biased to this, but at the same time, also our capacity to innovate, the people behind this, if it's in technology, if it's in the healthcare systems, just that amazing talent pool that we have, and hence why we're operating the digital medicine strategy with a very strong focus on Europe. It's incredible. That said, with the changes that have happened, let's face it, it's a bit of a pendulum swing in that we were probably a lot easier previously than what you would experience in the US side of things. And we saw this a lot, particularly in MedTech, I'd say, where you would have companies do the CE marking as part of their journey to get to the FDA approval. Now, of course, with MDR and IVDR, I guess that's what you're referring to, we've, of course, swung the pendulum back quite a way. I'm really interested to see how and what will happen now with more of these either generative AI types approaches, or let's say just everything that's covered by the AI Act, whether we might not actually see that Europe could become a better test bed to develop and validate technologies and then hence conquer other markets. But I mean, ultimately, a lot of our companies, they will make that transition over into the US because we really do see that massive kind of healthcare system as well as kind of the potential there. So ultimately, a lot of our companies will scale into the US. It's where the biggest market lies.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm going to take a hard right here, but you can say pass on this. But I don't mean to put you on the spot because some people in the audience have asked, and I was actually curious about it. Are you familiar with Babylon Health?
I am indeed. I do have only about a minute to talk about this because I'm already 2 minutes over. But sure.
That's true. You are 2 minutes over. So that being said, like I want to be like mindful of our time here. So final thoughts and comments
So
to our audience.
maybe let me give you a bit of a broader perspective, and it won't be specifically in the
I'm going to
context.
apologize to Bobby for holding you over for 2 minutes, but I can help
me
myself
later, but that's fine. No, the way we think about this is ultimately there's kind of three ways to play technology, if you will. It's existing technology, new channel. That is, for example, Netflix. It's the exact same content, but it's suddenly on demand. It's wherever you want it. The next is new technology, existing channel. That's what we've been doing in biotechnology for years. We will develop these totally new medication, new approaches, etc., but then commercialize through the pharma channels, which is extremely well and effective. Then we're into where we play, which is new technologies and new channels. If we take the deep sea example, the new technology is all of these AI vendors. They've developed these bespoke algorithms for specific analysis in these very unique cases, but the new channel hasn't been built yet. That's what deep sea is building. When we look at things like PAIR, for example, that was a new technology, totally revolutionary in its approach because, of course, it was a digital therapeutic. Kili Interactive, same thing. But then they were trying to rely on existing channels, for example, the farm industry, to help push that commercialization. It's where you need to be very careful when playing this space, because if you take both risks unwittingly, both the new technology and the new channel, you might have an incredibly difficult journey ahead of you, because not only will you need to build this new approach, to validate it, to show the utility, but then suddenly go about raising the capital and developing this entire new infrastructure to actually get it to the patient, get it into the healthcare system. So just to kind of wrap up, I think that's one of the things that I think we should be looking at a lot more as not only investors, but also as entrepreneurs in this space, seeing how does, if it's a new technology, fit with either new and or existing channels, and whether they've been built, or whether that's going to be a totally other headache that just hasn't been faced yet.
Fantastic. Well, Simon, really appreciate you spending some time with us. Sorry to keep you over. Let me put you in the back of the studio for now. So I wanted to thank our audience for joining us. And again, just as a reminder, if you want to learn more about digital medicine, I highly recommend go to sofinnovapartners.com. Scroll down. They have a digital medicine section. And if you want to learn more about some of the portfolio companies that Simon talked about today, let me bring them up. Thank you, Bami, for sharing them. For Deep Sea, it's deepsea.ai. For BioCortex, it's just biocortex.com. And for Kiro, it's kiro.bio. Thank you for joining us today, and we'll see you all next time on The State of MedTech. Bye for now.
Thank you for enjoying another epic episode of The State of MedTech. If you're feeling inspired and love this episode, do us a favor, hit that subscribe button and turn notifications on so you never miss an episode. And be sure to give us 5 stars and write a short review, because that helps more people discover this amazing community of ours. If you're a company who has a executive that you'd like to be on the show, or perhaps you want to sponsor one of the episodes, shoot us an email at hello@khateebandco.com. Take care, and we'll see you next time.